Good morning, guys. This is Monday the 8th. Tomorrow is Tuesday the 9th, and these are our last two lessons of the school year. And we're going to be looking at the end of World War I and actually getting into World War II. We're going to cover the war just really briefly today and tomorrow. Okay, so these are your last assignments. And I'm going to make it really easy on you this week. You don't have to write a thing while you're watching these videos this week, these video notes. You don't have to take notes on it. If you want to, you can, but there's a lot of yellow, so it'll take your time. It'll take a lot of time if you want to. But you don't have to. I just want you to sit back and experience what these wars were like. Today we're going to focus on why World War II started, so what led to the war, and then tomorrow we'll talk about the battles and give you kind of just a brief overview of the war. So today is World War II, the rise of war. We're going to talk about why World War II started. Okay, and here we go. So why did war happen again? Why was there another World War I? Well, to understand this, you have to look back at how World War I ends. Okay, so why was there a World War II? We got to look at the end of World War I in 1918. When America enters the war in 1917, we tip the balance of the war in favor of the Allies. Okay? It doesn't mean that the war is suddenly over, woohoo, America wins, that sort of thing. No, actually World War I kind of ends in a tie, a stalemate. Both sides agree that, hey, we're just going to stop fighting. Okay? There's something called an armistice in November of 1918 where both sides agree, let's just stop fighting and maybe we can work this out at the peace tables. And then a few months later, when they actually go to the peace tables, everybody blames Germany for the war. And Germany's like, whoa, 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 wait a second here. We agreed to stop shooting and we were going to work out a peace. Nobody said anything about blaming us for the war. But that is what ends up happening at the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I. Everybody puts the blame on Germany and says, Germany, you started this. They actually didn't. Remember, Serbia and Austria-Hungary did. But they get the blame for the war, and they're told, you're going to have to pay back money for the war. You're never allowed to become powerful again. And the Germans are absolutely humiliated. This is true across the board. Germans didn't believe that they had lost the war, and yet now they're being blamed for the war. They have to pay money for the war, and they're also being told that they can't have like a huge military or anything like that. It's true. At the end of this war, the treaty says Germany's military can only be so big. They can only have so many ships, so many airplanes, so many troops. And Germans are outraged. Even some of their territory is taken from them and given to create new countries like Poland and other places. And Germans are outraged over this. Most of them completely want revenge on this, including a young German soldier named Adolf Hitler. This is actually a picture of Hitler during World War I without the famous short mustache that most people associate with him. He was a young soldier who was an ambulance driver and had several other jobs. And when he hears about the end of the war and sees what happens, he's furious. He's enraged. He doesn't believe the Germans have lost the war. And he swears that if he ever gets into a position of power later in life, he is going to enact revenge on the countries that have belittled and humiliated Germany. So the seeds of hate, the seeds of war are really planted at the end of World War I. It's not a good peace, and it ends up leading to another war. Of course, there's some other major events in between all that that make war even more possible. And to look at that, we need to fast forward about 15 years to the 1930s. In the 1930s, the entire world is suffering from a Great Depression. What does that mean? The economies of the countries, the world's countries, is completely destroyed. Okay, the economies are not doing well. Millions of people can't find work. Like in the United States, 25%, 1 out of every 4 Americans does not have a job and can't find one. People can't pay for their basic needs. Governments are failing all around the world. It is literally the world in the middle of a Great Depression. Now, during that time of the Depression, most governments change. Because the economy is going so bad and people can't find jobs, they don't care who's in power. They just want to get rid of whoever is currently in power and replace them with someone else. So hopefully something can change and economies can get better and the world can turn around. So all over the world, governments are toppled. In Italy, a dictator named Mussolini is elected in. In America, Franklin Roosevelt is elected as president, and his ideas from the previous president, Herbert Hoover, are complete opposites. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rises to power. Why? Because people want change more than anything else, and they're willing to almost accept anybody to be able to get that sort of change. And they're going to live to regret that because it's going to lead to war. In Germany, Adolf Hitler rises to power. His political party is voted in. Hitler himself isn't voted in. That's a misconception, and there's a lot to it, so I'm not going to go into that part of it. But Hitler rises into power, and he promises two things to the German people. He promises he will get them jobs in the middle of the Great Depression, and he will provide them with a better life. And he has a plan for how to do this. But what most people don't realize at this time is that he's got ulterior motives for doing what he's doing right here. So he promises better jobs, a better life, and he creates a political party to try and group everyone together and get them on board with his political beliefs. He calls that party the Nazi Party. And he actually uses the worldwide symbol of peace at the time period as part of their flag, the swastika. Yeah, it was originally a peace symbol. He turns it into a symbol of hate. Okay? The Nazi Party rises in the 1930s. Now, part of the reason he comes to power is not only does he promise jobs, but he also points the finger, he points the blame at the bad economy at a specific group of people, the Jews. It's always easier to blame someone else for problems that are going on, to point a finger and go, hey, they're the ones that are causing it. Let's unite against them. Hitler uses those fears to come to power. So he blames the economy on the Jews. And the Germans, as they start to unite behind Hitler, they're actually encouraged. They're very happy about this because he delivers on the jobs that he promises. How does he do this? By breaking the treaties at the end of World War I that limited Germany's military size. Hitler basically says, we're not going to worry about the size of our military. We're going to make it as big as we can. We're going to build tanks. We're going to build airplanes. We're going to build ships for the Navy. And that's going to require workers to build those things. He hires millions of workers to start building up his military. People get jobs in Germany, and Germany is the first country in the entire world to emerge from the Great Depression stronger economically. It'll take America years longer to get to the same point Germany is in the late 1930s economically, because Hitler delivers on his promises. Now, of course, he's got some revenge that he's going to want to be pulling out here real soon, but he's got most of the Germans on board with what his plan is right here. Why? Because economics, money, matters to people. People, when they don't have jobs, when things are collapsing, have a lot of fear. And if the right person comes along and plays on those fears, it can lead to devastating results. In this case, it leads to the largest world war in world history. So Hitler comes to power, and he also promises to reconquer land that Germany had lost during World War I. And when the people hear him, he's a very good speaker. He's energetic, he's forceful, he's powerful. He is a very persuasive person to listen to. Heck, in the 1930s, he even becomes Time Life's Man of the Year on their cover. He is a popular figure worldwide. So it is with great popularity that Hitler comes to power. He's not seen as an evil guy until much, much later. And only few people recognized what kind of a monster he actually was during this time. People like Winston Churchill, the eventual leader of England. Meanwhile, there's other things happening on the other side of the world. So let's move from Europe over to Asia really quick so that you can understand a few things that are going on here. Japan, the country of Japan, which are these set of islands right over here, is rising in power as well as Germany is. Okay? This is the flag of Japan, the rising sun. Military leaders come to power in Japan in the same way that all these governments are changing leaders. Okay? Military leaders come to power in Japan with one goal: to expand the size of Japan, to take over territories and become a greater empire. And they have their sights set on Asia, countries like China that they want to take over, and the islands in the Pacific Ocean. They want to own all of it because they believe it will make their empire powerful and financially successful. So in the early 1930s, they start to take over land violently. In 1931, Japan invades Manchuria, which at that time was a country above China. It's part of China now. They take over the entire area. Then, years later, in 1937, Japan invades China and again takes over as much as they can. They end up taking over about half the country. There are empires, there are nations in the world that look at this and are completely horrified. The biggest one among them is the United States. We own a lot of territory in the Pacific Ocean during this time, and we are looking at Japan very worried about, are these guys going to expand so far that it's going to challenge the United States? And so, because we don't want to go to war with them, we decide that we're going to cut off some of their supplies. Japan gets most of their oil from the United States during this time. And Japan needs oil for their ships and their planes and their tanks to be able to attack. And America decides we are going to cut them off. This leads to problems between Japan and the United States in the 1930s. Now, to kind of protect themselves and to be as strong as possible, in 1940, Japan allies themselves with the country of Germany, led by Hitler, and Italy, led by a guy named Mussolini. And they create a treaty, an alliance called the Axis powers. These three countries agree that if one of them goes to war, all of them will go to war. Kind of like how alliances worked in World War I. These three countries ally themselves. Meanwhile, back in Germany, once jobs start rising up, then Hitler decides to flex his muscles a bit and see if he can make good on his promise to actually get some territory back. In 1936, Hitler invades former German territory, which is owned by France during this time, a buffer zone called the Rhineland. Now, part of World War I's treaty says that if Germany ever attacks this area, then it will automatically lead to war and all the countries of Europe will gang up and fight against Germany again. Hitler doesn't believe it, though. He believes if he invades places that the leaders of the world are so weak that they will back down and let him take over these territories without a fight. German generals, when they're crossing bridges going into this territory, they're worried that this is going to start a war. And Hitler tells them, nobody's going to do anything about it. We get to take this land because the world leaders are weak. They cross the bridges. They take over the land. The world leaders do nothing. They say things like, oh, Germany shouldn't do that. But they don't do anything meaningful. They don't send a military in to try and stop him. Hitler's flexing his muscles and seeing what he can get away with. And he notices he can get away with a lot by this point. So then he continues to flex his muscles. In 1938, Hitler invades Austria. And the world looks at Germany and says, you shouldn't do this. If you invade any more countries, we're going to build militaries to stop you. And yet again, Hitler doesn't believe it. He's like, oh yeah, sure, those are just words. And he takes over territories that he believes Germany should own. In 1938 and 1939, Hitler invades Czechoslovakia. Again, countries around Germany. And again, the world, instead of saying, hey, we're going to build a military and attack you now, they go, well, if you take over any more territory, we'll build a military and stop you. And again, Hitler believes he can get away with this and that he doesn't think the world leaders are ever going to try and stop him. Now, in the same time, Britain and France, they don't want another war. They're so sick of war, they want peace no matter what, even if it means backing down and letting Hitler get what he wants. This is called appeasement. When you give somebody something, regardless of what they're going to do, they back down to Hitler. They let him take over territories and just say, hey, don't do any more. Please don't do any more. And Hitler steamrolls them. He keeps taking over territories and doesn't believe it when European countries say, hey, if you go too far, we're going to try and stop you. He thinks it's all nonsense. Then on September 1st, 1939, German troops invade into a country called Poland. Now, before they invade, England and France tell Germany, if you invade specifically into the country of Poland, we will go to war with you. Hitler, yet again, because of all the events that have been happening in the last few years, doesn't believe them. He's like, oh yeah, sure, whatever. And he decides he's going to invade this territory. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades. They send their tanks in using a lightning type of warfare called Blitzkrieg. This time, Britain and France declare war. They're like, oh, enough is enough. We're declaring war against you. What they don't realize is in the years that they have allowed Germany to expand, Germany has become so strong militarily that Britain and France combined do not even nearly equal the strength of the German military. They have just entered into a war in which they are greatly unprepared. World War II has begun. Tomorrow we'll look at the different battles, but that is how war actually started. And I hope not only that you understand how this works, but also hopefully this is a really good eye-opener for even things that are happening in our own lives, in our own history now, that if you stand by and allow bad things to happen, like the European countries did with Hitler, you may be setting yourself up for even worse times later on. So make sure you know the right time to actually fight for what's right, because during the 1930s, Hitler could have been stopped much easier at any of those points when he was invading the Rhineland or Austria or Czechoslovakia, but they let him get stronger and stronger and stronger until it was almost too late. But we'll talk about that tomorrow. We'll talk about how Hitler almost won World War II and how the world was completely changed during events like Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, and events that continue to be meaningful to us to this day. Have a good day, guys.